I start out by cutting the material down for the legs of the headboard and the footboard. I used the circular saw to cut it down to a rough length. I even had my wife helping me in the shop today. She does this from time to time, and it's always nice having an extra set of hands around. This is 8/4 hard maple, so it's giving the circular saw a workout. We started out cutting the width of this on the bandsaw, but 8/4 over 60 inches long was a bit more than we wanted to handle on the bandsaw. So we decided to use the track saw. Now the depth of cut of my track saw is 2 inches, and some of this was over 2 inches thick. So I would line up for the cut and make multiple passes, dropping the blade just a little each pass. For those cuts over 2 inches, I would mark the curve on the back side and make a pass cutting the piece off. Being real precise with this at this point doesn't matter, since everything is cut oversized. And you can see right here the blade lacked about 1/8 of an inch cutting all the way through. So I just mark each end and mark the waist side, line up the track, and make those cuts. Then at the joiner, we would joint one face of each piece. I'm not concerned with the edges right now because I'm going to be gluing 2 pieces together to get the thickness that I need. After getting one face flat, I'll send them through the thickness planer to give me 2 flat sides that are parallel to each other. This process was done for both the headboard and the footboard legs. For whatever reason, I didn't record the glue up, or I misplaced the video files, but we have all seen that process before. One face and one edge is jointed and then planed to thickness. Then at the table saw, it's time for me to get back to work and cut those slats to their final width. And yes, she took back over the camera. Now it's time to remove the clamps on the glue up I failed to record. I'll separate the pieces, and then using an old cheap hand plane, I'll cut the dried glue off. This is one good reason to not throw your cheap hand plane away. They come in handy for this when you fail to remove the excess glue before it completely dries, and you can control the depth of cut. A cheap hand plane doesn't have to be real sharp for this use, and you're not beating up your joiner and planer blades with dried clumps of glue. Once that's done, I'll go back to the joiner and flatten one face and joint one edge. Then I'll plane each leg to its final thickness. At the table saw, I'll make multiple passes, raising the blade some with each pass until I'm more than halfway through the piece. Then I'll flip it and make the final cut, leaving me with a square leg. Then I'll go back to the planer and remove any saw marks, and I'll plane 2 adjoining sides, making the piece the same thickness all the way around. Now to cut to the length that I need. I checked my miter saw to ensure that it was cutting square. I would make the cut on one end. This will give me a square end, but for the repeated length cuts, I would move over to the crosscut sled, referencing the end I just cut on the miter saw against the positive stop of the sled, and then I'd make a cut. I'd flip the board and make the next cut until I cut the piece off. After all the legs are made, I'll use the router table with a featherboard to guide my cut and a 1/2 inch upcut spiral bit. I make a mark on my piece showing me where to stop my cut, and I place a piece of tape on the upper side to remind me I'm getting close to my mark. And I mark a piece of tape on the table showing me where the feed side of my bit is. You will see that in a moment. I'll start by removing about 1/4 inch of the material at a time, raising the bit each time and repeating until the slot is cut. You can see here the stopping point on the table. Now let's do the slats for the headboard and the footboard. Off camera, I milled the materials to 3/4 of an inch and cut the length at the miter saw. Using the dado stack, I'll make a 3/4 by 1/2 inch tenon on each end of each slat. Back to the legs for just a second, I added a little round over to all 4 corners, and I added the same round over to the bottom of each leg and sanded. To conceal the rounded end of this slot and allow for movement, I'll need to cut about 3/4 of an inch off of the tenon on the bottom slat only. I'll do this at the bench, marking the material to remove and cutting it by hand. Before putting this thing together, I'll mill up 2 supports for the slats. Since the slats are not made into a panel, I will need something to keep the boards flat to each other. I'll place 2 supports on each, the headboard and the footboard. And the holes drilled into the support pieces are slightly larger than the screws, which will allow the slats to move, but still holding them flat and in place. Now it's time to put this together. The top and bottom slats are the only pieces that get glued. This bed is going to be in our own home, and I don't foresee very little, if any, movement at all. Once the whole bed is assembled, it will be plenty strong and stable. If you choose, you can reinforce the top and bottom boards on each side by drilling through the back side of the legs and the tenon, and then drive a dowel or 2 through those legs and tenon to ensure that the boards never pull out. I chose not to do this, but if it's ever needed later on, I will. I feel the slip fit of the slot and the tenon and plenty of glue will be enough. I also use blue tape between the pipe clamps and the legs to prevent getting any black marks on the legs. Even though the clamps are not getting glue on them, they will still leave black marks. I also used a couple of parallel clamps to keep the slats together while the glue dries, and I'll use a 3rd pipe clamp on the opposite side to prevent any rolling of the legs. Once everything is clamped up, I'll check for square, and using a straw, I'll clean up any glue squeeze out. I also added the curve to each end of the slat supports. After marking the curve, I cut the excess off with the bandsaw. I know a 1/4-inch blade or something like that would be a lot easier to do this with, but I really didn't want to change out for a smaller blade for just a small amount. Call me lazy. Then I sanded the profile on the belt sander by working my way back to my line. I clamped a square to the bed and used slat support with the pre-drilled holes to mark the locations of the screws, and then pre-drilled those locations in the footboard and the headboard, and then attached the supports. Once the glue had dried, it's time to make the X's for the head and the footboards. Now there is no room at all to get your hand and a pencil under this board, so after lining up the first board to make the cross, I'll clamp the board in its desired location and slide a steel rule under the board flush with the leg and use spring clamps to hold it in place. I'll do this on both ends, then just flip the board over and mark it. Once it's marked, I'll just cut those angles on the miter sled. I'll show you in a minute how I got those angles in order to set the angle of the miter sled. This one is a little different. I cut the first end just like the first board, and because one end is up on the much thicker leg and elevated above the center board, I placed a piece of scrap the same thickness under the first end and then clamped it down. Then I placed some weight on the center to make it meet the first board. Now I can use a steel rule just like before. And you can see here the distance I had to weight it down. Then I'll remove and mark, and this one cut will match up to the other side of the center board. Here's how I got the degrees for the miter sled. Whatever the angle is, that's what I set my sled at and make the cut. Doing the second half of this piece, I'll use a straight edge just to make sure that my pieces remain straight with each other. Using a scrap piece under one end, I'll line up the rule on the far end and mark and cut. Let me know in the comments if you found this helpful. I think it makes for a nice but easy fit. Now I'll move the piece to the floor with the main section of the cross clamped to the footboard and pre-drill the hose. I'm using a brad point bit and only going through the slats enough that the brad point will mark the cross material. Using those marks, I'll pre-drill with a smaller bit, then I'll clamp it back in place so that all the holes match up. Then I'll fasten them together. I do the other pieces the same way, just one piece at a time. I took some offcuts and glued them together to make the post caps. I started out joining one edge of each piece. With the jointed edge against the table saw fence, I'll cut the other side parallel to the first. Then I'll square up one end on the miter sled, and then using the pause to stop, I'll cut to its final length. I'll round over all four corners of each piece with a trim router and a round over bit. The old Roman OG bit. Using this bit, I'll cut the top profile. Instead of raising the bit each time, I'll just apply a little more pressure with each pass, making 3 or 4 passes, and always starting on the end grain sides. These are going to be attached to the top of each post using dowels and glue. But first, a little sanding. Gotta love it. Then I made this jig as a dowel guide for both the post and the cap. You can see the offset of the post size versus the cap size. First, I'll drill a couple of 3/8 inch holes for the dowel placement. Then 2 smaller holes to screw the jig in place. It would be pointless if it moves any. Then apply glue and dowels and clamp in place to dry. Now it's time to make the top and bottom horizontal rails. The top horizontal rails will be a little bit different length than the bottom due to the caps on the post. I'll get that measurement first and cut the length. Then each gets sanded. I'll place a piece of scrap to the front of the headboard and the footboard. This will allow me to line up the horizontal rail to the flush with the cross on the face side of each. I'll use glue only to hold this, plus a couple of 100 pounds of clamps. The top was done on both pieces in the same way, and now it's time to do the bottom. Now I need to make the bed rails. I'll first cut to rough length with a circular saw. These will end up around 1.5 inches thick, and I only have 3 4/4 boards, but I have width to these boards. So I'll plane to 3/4 inches thick and joint one edge. Then I'll cut to the width that I need and save the cutoffs. When I build one of these rails up, I'll just turn the off-cut side to the inside. It will be fine. And 400 pounds of clamps is used in this demonstration. Using the track saw, I will straighten one edge and cut to the final width at the table saw. Then cut the length at the miter saw. You can see here how I use the offcut to finish up this one rail. I rounded over the inside and the outside of the top of the rail only, and the outside of the bottom of the rail. I will be needing the bottom inside of each rail square. Then everything is sanded up to 180 grit. I used a 1 3/4 by 1 3/4 inch piece. This will hold the bed slats under the mattress. I'll mark each location for a 3 inch by 3/4 inch slat. I'll cut to length. And then cut out notches for the slats with the dado stack. This gets glued to the inside bottom of each rail. You can add screws if you feel a need to. I have made several of these beds and I really don't think it's necessary. Just don't let your kids jump on the bed. If they can drive a car, they shouldn't jump on the bed. Once that dries, I'll sand everything flush and remove any squeeze out there might have been. Now to make the slats, I'll just cut 3 inch wide strips, cut to length and plane to thickness. Now the rustic farmhouse look is what management wanted, so I stained everything with a dark stain, and I believe this is a walnut stain. Then my wife brushed on an antique white chalk paint. She wanted the brush stroke look with a dark stain lightly showing through the paint. Then sanding through the paint in selected areas to give it that old worn appearance. And now for me, the breaks are over and it's now time to give everything 2 coats of urethane. And for whatever reason, I failed to record mounting the hardware to the bed. I made this bed around a year ago and just now getting around to editing the video, so I really don't know what happened to it. Here are some stills of the bed in place in a guest room in our home. And I purposely did not record the making of these bedside tables. And yes, I used pocket hole joinery. Scott Jordan would be proud. They were stained and painted and scuffed up to match the bed. Just something to hold a clock or a bedside lamp. Well, that'll do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please give the video a thumbs up. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And until next time, thanks for watching.